Hey, welcome everyone to the first ever episode of Best Served Cold. This is the new podcast from Revenge AI, where we talk about everything from AI and reverse engineering through to protecting your software supply chain. It's a big scope, right? There's a lot of things to cover. So, with me today on our first ever episode, I'm super excited for this. We have Anuj Soni, malware course author. I had to get that right there. We were talking before about, I think he should be writing mystery books, but hey ho. He is a SANS instructor of the 710 course and co-author of the 610 course, and just all-round malware analyst guru. Anuj, thank you so much for coming on this with me today.
Yeah, thanks, David. Appreciate being here.
So, you know what? I've kind of stolen your introduction away from you, so we'll carry on. But ultimately today we're going to be talking a bit about AI, malware, exploit development, and what I would love to do. I'd love to kick this off with just a little bit, Anuj, about your journey through reverse engineering. Like, what drew you to malware analysis?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'll try to summarize the past 20 years here in just a couple minutes. But I first probably got exposed to cybersecurity back in college. So I did one of the probably most general majors you could do, general technology majors. It was called information systems. Still trying to figure out what that means. But when I progressed to like a master's program, I did have to choose a focus. And given that at that point in time, there were starting to come in the news like more word of breaches and attacks, I decided to go the information security route. At least that's what we used to call it back then. And so when I was in that master's program, I had this, what I didn't realize at the time was a really neat opportunity to take a course called incident response. And the challenge, though, from the college students' perspective, was that this class was only taught on Saturdays. So at the time, it didn't seem like a very good opportunity to me, but I still decided to do it. And the thing I didn't appreciate was who the class was taught by. And so at the time, I had never heard of the company. But the reason it was on Saturdays was because the instructors were actual practitioners, and they worked for Foundstone. And so many of you have probably heard of Foundstone. They're one of the the original security consulting companies. Many of the founders of Foundstone went on to found other very well-known companies like CrowdStrike and Cylance, where both David and I used to work. And so the instructors, although they were not Stuart or Sean, they obviously knew their stuff. And so that's really what got me excited about defensive cybersecurity. And then when I got out into the professional kind of realm, I really sought out those sorts of opportunities. It took me a few years to get there, but eventually ended up doing proactive hunt and incident response. And that is, of course, where I came face to face oftentimes with malware, which is something we would many times discover on these victim workstations. And I was just really excited at first by this idea that by studying this code, I could get, at least in my mind, as close as possible to, like, in some ways, meeting the attacker, right? To seeing what they actually coded, to understand their intent, to understand their objectives. And I could do that in many cases by just analyzing one single file. So my personality is one where I prefer to dig deep into one thing versus know superficially 10 different things. And so I loved this idea that I could spend my time with just one or two files and understand so much about an attack and about the adversary. So once that happened to me about 13, 14 years ago, I was sold. And that's where I just kept digging deeper each year into malware.
That's crazy, man. A Saturday class, right, for incident response, whereas now we would have entire, courses and modules taught around just that subject, right? There's so much going on. And could you imagine if it had been Sean or Stuart teaching those classes? That would have been mind-blowing. But what I love is that you're now taking that whole mindset and still giving back. I know you've obviously developed a lot of courses as well, but you run your own YouTube channel where you teach, reverse engineering, like basics through to advanced capabilities, right? You help people with some of those complex issues. So with that in mind, I mean, I'd love to know what your favorite thing about reverse engineering is. Just the whole concept of it. Like, I think you touched on a little bit there, taking one file and just knowing everything about it. But is there anything else that you're like, this is just the best thing about it?
What I really like, I think, about reverse engineering, and not to say this doesn't apply to like other cybersecurity disciplines, I just love, like, these days when I think about reverse engineering, I think about the personality of like a scientist, right? In that you are, you have this thing in front of you, and in many cases, like a file or a group of files, some chunk of code, and you're really just trying to like probe this thing you're trying to provide it inputs, you're trying to understand the outputs, you're trying to generate hypotheses about what happens in between, and it's just very exploratory. And I really like that. And in some ways, it makes me even today uncomfortable. And I think that's good for me because, and again, this does apply to other areas within cybersecurity. But you don't always know if you're right. So, if, for example, like when we were both at Silence, one of our jobs was to determine if something is good or bad, right? Is it legitimate software? Is it malware? Is it something fuzzy in between, which a lot of that sort of analysis ends up leading to? And so you never really know in many cases with 100% confidence if what you're looking at is actually bad or if it's just some old proprietary software that's been around for years. And so there's that discomfort with like the exploration of it. And so I try to focus more on learning from the exploration instead of like getting to the quote right answer. And I think that's a very healthy thing for all of us to get comfortable with. So I like reverse engineering, not only because it's just fun for me, but also because it makes me comfortable with the uncomfortable a little bit, which is just not knowing if I'm right or not. And I think that it really forces you rather to just like enjoy the process instead of like try to get to the answer. Because when you're REing something, oftentimes you don't get to the answer, but you can still learn a lot about a particular like technology during the process. And you can still improve your RE skills, even if you never, quote, get to the answer.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, right? You mentioned Silence and what we were doing back in, I'm going to say back in the day. That makes me seem a lot older than I am. Despite all the white in the beard, right? I'm not that old. But I think what's really interesting is if you went back to traditional detection logic, right? It was all rule-based, which meant that when something was detected, if you had to determine if it was truly malicious, false positive, true positive, all that kind of jazz, you had the rule to go off of. You could look at that and compare the output. When you started getting into the machine learning space, one, the scalability shot up, right? We had so much more to actually take a look at, and then it was all black box. You had absolutely no idea why the models or the product decided to start detecting it and trigger on it, and we had to sit down and then start. It was almost like a back to basics for reverse engineers to go, right, now you need to actually truly understand the process because you are going to have to reverse engineer this file, and arguably, within 20 minutes you could work out whether a file is good or bad. A lot of people just throw in a sandbox, that's all well and good, but now we're in a stage where customers are asking more questions because they're becoming more security savvy. They want context. Incident responders, they need the context to make the right decision. So it's certainly an interesting point, right? Is getting a bit more comfortable with those uncomfortable things is definitely something we have to do.
And if I may interrupt, I mean, you made a really good point just now of why you still need the reverse engineering expertise, or in our case, the malware analysis expertise, even in the age of AI, right? Because, we're talking about, not to age us too much, but we're talking about, 2015 or so when Cylance was using models to detect malware. And so in those cases, if we were performing validation, right, to understand if it was, quote, right or wrong, and we determined that there was something off, we'd have to kind of do that manual analysis to try and figure out not only, is it malware or not, but to try and understand what features maybe it had missed or we could take advantage of in order to improve the model, right? And so even in this age where you can get, a right or wrong answer that is, fairly accurate in many cases, that doesn't mean you don't need the expertise anymore, right? Because that validation is the feedback loop. And if you don't have that validation by a human, I mean, these models are useless to us.
Absolutely. It's an interesting one. I'd actually love to talk about. Let's focus on the AI stuff a little bit more, to be honest. So, we've gone over a bit of an example there of a real world scenario where AI is impacting reverse engineers. But I still think that there is room for that to grow. And I'm not just saying that because I work for Revenge, where we make a platform to help reverse engineers. But, in your experience historically, do you think that reverse engineering shouldn't be automated by AI? Are there parts of that shouldn't involve AI at all? Or are you actually glad that, the AV engines have moved towards that? We talked about scalability. It's getting more files, more detections, more work for us, really. With the continuous improvements of, we think things like Copilot and other ones that are providing that context that was historically coming from reverse engineers. Do you still think that's a valid use of it, or should we take a step back and go, these tools are only as good as their operators?
Right. I mean, generally the way I feel about AI is excitement. And I think that if you're not excited, or if one is not excited about it, then you need to kind of reflect on that, because if you're not excited about it, you may ignore it. And if you ignore it, I think that that is doing a disservice to your own career.
Mm,
What I'm excited about is the idea that it's going to actually give me, as an analyst, more time to focus on the interesting stuff, right? Because, even if you use automation today, still there's a lot of pattern recognition that you're manually doing when you analyze code in order to understand what it does and what the context of that is. In particular, when it comes to like recognizing groups of instructions or code that is accomplishing a certain objective. I mean, that is something, I think we can all agree AI can help quite a bit
yeah.
with. It's already doing that in terms of AI tools that are, for example, automatically renaming arguments and variables and functions based on the code there. It's the context, though, where the human, I think, is still very important. And so I think the success comes from the partnership between the automation and the human. It doesn't come from the automation replacing the human. I think it comes from the automation accelerating what the human can do. So
Mm,
I think that there is a fantastic role that it can play in both detection as well as analysis. Now, I mean, any capability, whether it's AI or not, where I just have to press a button and it just supposedly does all the work for me, I am very cautious about that and skeptical about it. Now, you can kind of address that skepticism by having the appropriate feedback loop so that that automation improves. And of course, certain AI products do that. But to sum it up, I mean, I'm excited by it. I think there's absolutely a great role that it can play for detection and for analysis. It's just about finding that right balance between taking advantage of the automation and AI to accelerate your understanding, to automate pattern recognition, therefore allowing the human to actually focus on the more deeper tasks the deeper tasks, but also the big picture, right? So the big picture of what these sample is doing, what these functions in collection are accomplishing, I think that's also where human experience plays in quite a bit. So yeah, I'm generally excited
yeah.
by it.
I love this because I think it's something you and I talked about when we met in person for the first time, despite the fact we worked together for years. We only managed to meet for the first time in DC a couple of months back. But I think what's really important here is there's a whole constant conversation, right, about people potentially losing their jobs to AI, being replaced. And actually, what we're talking about is the realities of it all. When automation came out, people thought automation was going to replace them, and in some cases, it did. But that happens with any technology. But what we're talking about now is actually people going, well, I can use this to get rid of the things that are cumbersome. They're repetitive tasking. They're things that don't need me to apply my skills and my knowledge. Equally, at the same time, those repetitive taskings can be turned into training opportunities to help upskill people, right? AI can bridge that gap to help get people more skills, which I think is great. But I think the crux of all of this is that people aren't in, despite what we've seen in the media and despite some people being let go in favor of AI, for reverse engineers especially, and cybersecurity professionals as a whole, AI is never going to be able to replace you. And I've always thought that simply because the trust isn't always there. And we talked about it at the start. Silence as a product was great for detecting malware, but we still had to have a human at the other end, sometimes verifying potential false positives or true positives and make sure that the models were correct. That is a big process. And even with agentic AI, I still don't think we're ever going to be able to remove humans from the loop. So
Yeah, I mean,
I'm
I think that so first off, I think the fear of job loss, I mean, especially in this climate, I think that
yeah,
is very understandable, whether it's AI or not, that there is
yeah,
a big change happening in the industry. And, I mean, I lost my job a little over a year ago, so I know what that's like to have that fear and to work through it, and to have that fear really just become a
yeah,
reality. So that all is understandable, but I think that we're all going to have to make a choice, and I do think it's a choice of whether or not you remain optimistic about the impact of AI on your job, or whether you become fearful of it.
yeah,
Because yeah, as I mentioned earlier, if you become fearful of it, yeah, unfortunately, you will probably make the wrong choice of just ignoring it. And if you
absolutely.
ignore it, I think there is a good chance that part of what you do could be replaced by AI. But if you're excited by it, if you want to learn a bit more about it, if you want to understand how you can use it to expedite your work and have even more fun, frankly, with it, then I think that it is overall a positive. I mean, if I told you, hey, there's a really cool tool out there, right? Forget AI for a minute. If I told you there's a really cool tool out there that will help you do your job faster, and you may even along the way learn more about the subject matter that you're actually analyzing because you'll have like this thing helping you along the way. Like, I think anyone would be excited by it. I think just the nature of AI is that there is a bit of an emotional response about just the humans totally being kicked out of the loop. And while there are certain parts of an analysis process for which that might happen someday, you're always going to need someone, an expert, or a group of experts to perform that validation and that investigation. So
Yes.
I think that I think the RE skill set is not going to go away. The way it's applied might be a little different because you
Absolutely.
won't have to do that kind of mundane tasking. It might be focused on more fine-tuning models, on providing that
Yeah.
validation, understanding new features to extract, things of that sort. So
Absolutely.
there's no doubt about it. There is a shift. But I think that you can ride that wave instead of kind of falling under it.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think a large portion of the fear definitely comes from the media's interpretation of AI. I think, you know, good publicity never sells, right? Or is it
Yeah.
good news
Got to
never
get those
sells?
clicks. Yeah.
Yeah, you got to get those clicks. I mean, if you take a look at LinkedIn, the conversation is all over the place around people going, "Oh, is AI going to replace me?" And I think some people saw it as the be all and end all that would help pinch that bottom line, but actually, it's not quite there yet. It's not that. It's never going to be that. I don't think. As you said, you're always going to need those experts to apply their knowledge. It's just that their application will change over time, right? So I guess the important question is then: do you use any AI tools in your day to day in terms of reverse engineering, or are you still, 20 years of experience? You're like old school. I mean, do you use tools like IDA and Ollie and Ghidra, or do you just look at it in Notepad and go, I can work this out?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, after 20 years of experience, I lean towards old school, but like I said, it is a choice. So I do try to make a better choice more often in at least experimenting with these tools. So on a day-to-day basis, with the nature of the work I do, AI, I have to be very careful, and I think most people should be careful about how they integrate AI into their day-to-day, like day jobs. Of course, making sure you have all the appropriate approvals, et cetera.
Yep.
Because the reality is a lot of these AI tools, not all of them, but a lot of them do require uploading information or even the whole file to the cloud. And so that is something that we have to be cautious about. So I'm definitely cautious in my approach to using AI, but at the same time, I am experimental with it. So I do try to understand and read about, what improvements, what value it can add. When it comes to AI for actually doing the analysis, obviously there are tools that will do those sorts of things, like I mentioned earlier, like function renaming. Ghidra MCP is a great kind of open source example of a tool that will, you just kind of set it loose on your sample, and it'll connect to, a model, and it'll be able to come up with all sorts of, what seem to be good information about what functions do, and take the actions that an RE normally would, which is to actually start renaming things. And that's all great. I am probably most excited about AI tools that kind of sit with the analysts, so that are more interactive, where they might even sit in the interface itself. They might provide insight into a function that you're looking at, allow you to ask questions about that function. Now, again, all of these kind of products do have risks in terms of cloud access. It's like one I've had a little bit of runtime with is Binary Ninja's Sidekick, which I think is a great name because it literally feels like a sidekick when you're using it. It has access to the code, of course. It's literally built into the interface. And rather than just doing everything for you, it's really feels like it's there to help, right?
Yeah.
Feels weird to say that about a tool, but it's almost like having another expert sitting with you side by side as you analyze some code. And as a kind of day-to-day reverse engineer, that really excites me because it allows me to strike a balance that I'm comfortable with, which is still doing some manual analysis, but getting some help along the way, so that I can speed up my process. So those interactive assistants, I think, are really cool. I hope that there'll be more of an evolution with those, which I'm sure there will be, given the state of things. But that's kind of the degree to which I currently use AI. Of course, just like anybody else, I do occasionally, copy and paste a code snippet into a prompt. which again is for me a very it's manual in the sense that you're literally copying and pasting something, but it's also more controlled, which is
Yeah.
something I'm comfortable with right now in terms of not giving access to a tool to the entire code base, but a certain function that
Yeah.
I'm interested in.
Well, I mean, as you rightly said, right, reverse engineers are dealing with sensitive data, and when you send it to an AI solution, you're giving away access, right? You're giving away where that data goes. It goes into a black box that you only have that level of assurance from the provider that they're not going to do anything with it. But yeah, I mean, you talked about some great tools there. Shameless plug, Revenge AI can do all that as well. We've got those same integrations because at the end of the day, you're right. It should be a tool that sits alongside the analyst. It shouldn't be something there to override them or to replace them or anything like that. It should be something that enables them and skills them up. So things like the symbol debug recovery, right? That is an arduous process. Having a tool that can help you do that makes it so much easier, right? Especially when you start looking at functions where you can hunt those functions across different families and binaries and look at overlaps. It gives you a bit of a clearer picture. So I'm glad that you're using those tools, right? As a veteran of the industry, having the likes of yourself and others in that space start adopting these tools, I think helps some of the newer generation realize that it's okay for them to use it. Because sometimes there seems to be a bit of a cultural thing that says, right, you shouldn't use AI. If you use it, it's diluting your ability to deliver. I use it for a bit of coding. I know how to write Python code. I know how to reverse engineer. But anything that makes my life easier, I'm not going to complain about because there's stuff that I'd rather be doing. There are other things to focus on. But I think the newer folks, I think there's been a lot of adoption in it very early on. And then it's almost like people are getting shamed for using it. They're getting called out for the fact that they're using these tools. And actually, they absolutely should be because they're not going away. We can be really certain of that. They're only going to improve, and those who kind of bury their head in the sand are going to get left behind.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I will say, at the risk of sounding like an old man, I think the newer generation or younger folks who are earlier on in their career, I do feel that they have to be almost more careful than perhaps we did when we were coming up in this field. We had no choice in many cases but to do it the hard way. And while the hard way is slow and by definition hard, you do learn a lot by doing it the hard way. And especially when you're talking about a skill like reverse engineering, which is really based on your ability to understand and learn what's happening under the hood. A lot of that could potentially be masked for you, but depending upon what kind of prompts you're delivering and whether or not you understand what you're actually submitting to the prompt or understand what it's actually returning to you, right? So you could, in theory, tell the prompt to code something up and then try to run it. You get some sort of runtime error. You provide that back to the prompt, and you have no idea what the code actually, any ability to actually validate the accuracy of the code. I think that is a little dangerous. And so, when it comes to learning the skill of malware analysis, I still think it's very important to do it the slow manual way first, because that puts you in a position to really be at some point in the future an expert. And when I say expert, I don't mean like you have to be top 1%, but you might just be the expert in the room, right? In a few months, just by having those kind of manual skills to understand, whether what AI produces is right or wrong without asking the AI if it's right or wrong.
Yeah. No, I like that.
Yeah.
I think you're absolutely right. You can't use AI as a replacement for a foundation of knowledge, but I think it's okay to use it to help you build out your foundation, as long as you have enough to critically evaluate what's being provided by the AI. If you can look at something subjectively that's being provided to you and question whether it's right, then you're in a position to use the AI. If you are blindly accepting and trusting everything it says, maybe you need a little bit more time, right? But asking it to explain what something's doing, or having it give you a summarization of something that you've looked at never hurts, as long as it maps to what you think is also happening. All right? If you're using it as a secondary validation for what you think is going on, great.
Right. No, I agree with that. And if you're using it as a way to just come up with ideas for things to test, right?
Yeah.
So you're still going to do the test, but you need some ideas because you're not familiar with a certain technology. I agree. I think it's a really a great place to brainstorm more than anything.
I'm always really interested in AI bridging the gap between elements of reverse engineering, right? You know, we talked a bit about malware analysis, and I think you said something to me once which I really resonated well, right? Is malware analysts are reverse engineers who can script. Exploit developers are reverse engineers who can code. Two very different disciplines, but with an underlying theme of reverse engineering. And I'm interested just on your thoughts. I know you're very much a malware analyst, but on your thoughts of like using AI to bridge that skill gap and almost kind of help malware analysts become exploit developers, but also helping exploit developers discover new pathways for thinking, because I think the thought tracks are very different for the two, right?
Yeah, so one thing I mentioned that so currently the job I've been doing for about 3 months actually has a more offensive edge to it. So I'm still a reverse engineer, but it does involve some vulnerability research, and it's honestly the first time I've done that before, which is why I was really excited by the opportunity to do that. And so it's helped me kind of understand at least some of the overlap between doing RE for defensive purposes and offensive purposes. So, from a defensive perspective, as a malware analyst, as I mentioned earlier, you're doing a lot of black box testing, right? You're trying to see how this code works, what it does dynamically. You're trying to see if you can change elements of the environment, if that produces some sort of different behavior. And of course, you're looking at the actual code as well by decompiling it or disassembling it. When you're talking about vulnerability research, and I'm going to say up front, I'm not an expert in vulnerability research. Okay, so take this from a guy who's done 3 months of it. But what's been really fascinating to me as someone who's done 3 months of offensive RE, but also has 15 plus years of defensive RE, is that offensive RE and vulnerability research specifically, it is right. Again, it's about finding weaknesses in a program that could be exploitable. And first of all, exploiting something doesn't even always have to involve writing many lines of code, right? It could be a very simple approach to changing the environment in a certain way that produces the intended objective, right? The intended outcome, but not something that the developers of that program actually intended, right? So you're taking advantage of a code execution in some way to achieve your own goals. And as I'm saying that out loud, even now, right? I mean, that's not so different than what we do when we're analyzing malware. We're trying to get this malware within a closed environment to act like it's in its intended target environment so that we can produce certain behaviors to allow us to understand really what it's capable of doing, even though it's not in its intended target environment. And so if you apply that mindset to vulnerability research, I mean, it actually works pretty well, because just by, even without writing a single line of code, by providing it with certain inputs, right, and understanding the outputs, trying to determine what happens in between, changing those inputs, you can learn a lot about a program. I mean,
Yeah,
if you automate
absolutely.
that, that's called fuzzing.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of the overlap between the two. And to your point, I mean, AI having access to an LLM can certainly, and has helped me for sure, kind of bridge that gap a little bit, because at a very basic nature, it's provided me with a lot of insight into kind of changing the target of my mindset, right? So I'm used to analyzing malware. I'm not used to analyzing like what is otherwise a legitimate program, perhaps,
Yeah.
or something that's not really doing anything malicious, just trying to, whatever, help the user with some sort of intended objective. And it's kind of helped me to shift my mindset by providing me the background on the technology, because when you're doing offensive RE, you're not always looking at a Windows program, which is what I do for malware analysis. You're sometimes looking at other software, other hardware. But again, you can apply the same mindset. So what you really need then, the gap is in the foundational knowledge for that
Yeah.
technology. And brainstorming with AI and an LLM has been huge for me for that.
No, I could not agree more. I think that's a wonderful example of taking those two different mindsets, right? Of bridging that gap and using these models and these capabilities to help you as a reverse engineer. I don't want to say grow. I mean, grow, maybe grow is the right word, but kind of explore new avenues and pathways that maybe historically you wouldn't have necessarily been exposed to. Is that a fair summarization?
Yeah, yeah, and I do think that the fact that I'm thinking back to like even what you said earlier about using AI earlier on in your professional career. I think the benefit of sitting where like you and I are right now, where again I'm making us sound so old, but but you and I are right now, where we have a couple of decades behind us, is that I feel like again these LLMs, you have to know the right question to ask, and although they do go out of their way to provide extra context and extra information, and even suggest asking itself questions. Like in my mind right now, there's no replacement for asking an experienced-based question.
Yes.
And we
Yeah,
can do
very
that.
true.
Even if it's a technology I don't understand, I can still come up with the right questions to ask. I feel at least that I can. And in order to kind of move forward and apply my RE mindset to a technology I've never interacted with before. And so I think that is a skill too. And I don't know, learning that skill off the top of my head, I'm not sure how, but I know that doing it the hard way first has helped to kind of be able to ask those right questions.
It definitely sounds it. You mentioned something there, and I'd love to touch on this just for the community as well. Is actually, as an instructor, how do you define the core mindset of a great reverse engineer?
Yeah, I mean, these days it's kind of, I guess, similar to what I mentioned earlier. It's the mindset of a scientist, right? It's like it's imagining you're working in a lab, and I don't mean like a computer lab, although that's probably where we end up doing this work. I mean like like a mad scientist lab, right? That's the way I like to think of it, because there's a lot of unknowns when you're REing something, and so I think the best mindset to bring to the table, the kind of core skill set to I'd say it's a mindset to bring and a skill set to develop is the idea of experimentation, right? And so you come in with not a lot of context in many cases, right? On the job, sometimes you're just given a file. It'd be great. Occasionally you get the context of, okay, we found the file here at this time, and it was interacting with these other files, and we got these
Yeah.
alerts. But in many cases, you don't have that context. And in the case of offensive RE, you only have the context of what you have in front of you. And so I think that coming into malware analysis, just understand that there is a degree of exploration, although you should have a process, right? It's not like 100% art by any means.
Yes.
There should be a process you follow. There is a way, I think at least, to learn malware analysis in a structured manner. But understand that there is no getting around the fact that there's going to be a lot of unknowns,
Yeah.
and that at the end of the day, you're just kind of taking the sample and you're prodding it and you're seeing what you can get out of it. And that as long as you are learning, right, as long as like you provide an input and you get an output, maybe you don't understand what that output is. Well, now you have a target for investigation and research. And so you can kind of take the next step. I think reverse engineering kind of has I think it has a reputation of requiring people to be computer science majors, and that can be intimidating for a lot of people. And so one of the first things I always try to tell people, especially those I teach, is that I am not a programmer. I've never have been. As I mentioned earlier, my degree was not in computer science. To some degree, I think absolutely it helps, right? But it's not required. You can still do really well in this field just by following your curiosity, and you don't have to go back to school for 4 years.
Yeah. No, that's very true.
And so kind of those would be my suggestions. And again, in terms of a mindset, I really do think that as long as the idea of analyzing malware intrigues you, if you just follow that and don't get bogged down in the things you don't understand,
Yep.
it's an iterative approach. So each sample you look at, you learn a little bit more about the process, about your process, and of course about the sample itself. And over time, all of that knowledge does build up. And the only other thing I'll add here is that I think what I do see some people earlier on in their career sometimes do, which is understandable, right? Especially these days, is I think you have to ask yourself how much time you're spending reading about something and how much time you're actually doing the thing. And people have all the books, they have all the articles, they got all the feeds, they got all the X accounts, that they're following all the right people, and spending hours a day potentially doing that. But then if I ask, okay, when was the last time you actually, for example, analyzed a malware or reverse engineered something? Well, maybe that was a month ago, a year ago, whatever it was. And that's just not the way you're going to learn. And that's one thing that I love about malware analysis is that you don't actually need to have a job that requires malware analysis to learn malware analysis.
Yes.
Sometimes I think, and I could be wrong in some ways here, but when I think about the offensive skills like pen testing, for example, or even vulnerability research, like you kind of need something that's vulnerable or that it's
Yep.
exploitable. And by the way, attacking infrastructure on the internet, not exactly legal. And so, these are all things that you need kind of permission to do.
Yeah.
But analyzing malware, you could just download something into your VM and start looking at it. And you don't need to
Absolutely.
ask anyone for that.
No, that's it. I think the only thing that you have to be careful of is obviously you set up your environment right. And I mean, there's a ton of videos online that help people who are getting into that space, making sure that your environment is set up correctly, because it can go disastrously wrong if you start downloading malware. But
Yeah,
no, I
yeah.
love
Don't
that. I
run
think
ransomware on your enterprise network. I agree.
no, oh yeah, absolutely right. Unless of course you're on your way out the door and you just want to leave a bad
I didn't say
impression as you
that.
go.
David did.
I said nothing. AI deepfake. That's what it was. No, so I love that. The core mindset for reverse engineering. I mean, in my head, it's always been, and this is what I tell people, it's the people that go, enough is not enough. When you're looking at something, it's not enough to say, oh, it's malware. Well, why is it malware? What's it doing? Those kind of people make the best reverse engineers across the board, because they're just innately curious about everything going on. And I love the mad scientist impression. What's going through my head now is use some goggles, a white lab coat, and hair all over the place, and you just
Yeah.
pull
Whatever
apart
makes it
functions
fun,
and be
do
like,
it.
no, that's it, right? Yeah, no. So no, that's fantastic. One thing that I'm curious about, you mentioned that anyone can download malware and get going, and I think that's absolutely perfect. Do you think companies should support RE talent? Should every blue team have at least one reverse engineer? You've got the SOC is obviously that's a different kind of mindset. It's a different approach to cybersecurity. But do you think it's worth a SOC always having at least one reverse engineer who not sending it out to a third party location, but someone in house that can help them immediately get context?
Yeah. A few years ago, I would say quite simply yes. But these days, especially in this kind of job climate, it's understandable to me that hiring a full-time reverse engineer who has, 15 years of experience just doing reverse engineering is maybe a tall order, right? Because maybe they don't have malware to analyze or something else to reverse engineer on a daily basis for this person to do. So the way I like to phrase it now is that I think every blue team should have someone with reverse engineering skills, right? And that means that you have to have, ideally some years of experience, or at least be interested in developing that experience. But I do think that there has to be someone on any defensive team who has that skill set, because otherwise, yeah, you run the risk of just listening to whatever automated tool or AI product you use, and just kind of going forward with whatever the answer is there. So I think that it's important to build that skill set for someone to have that skill set, but I don't necessarily think they need to be a quote like full-time RE.
Yeah.
But I do think that mindset and that skill set is important to have somewhere on the team.
Okay. I think it's an interesting one, because actually a lot of the SOC analysts I've met, they embody that same curiosity, despite the fact that their day job sometimes is looking at logs or behavioral information. They still have that curiosity mindset. So actually, it's not too much of a stretch for them to bridge that gap in a lot of situations. What I think is a challenge for them potentially is that they're actually being encouraged to think more like red teamers, because they are dealing with those behaviors and those attacks which are human driven, as opposed to just dropping a payload on an endpoint. So no, it's really interesting. I'm fully behind AI, right? I don't think I don't think I could be working for Revenge if I'm not. They make an AI tool. It'd be very silly if I'm like, hey, no, we shouldn't be using AI to bridge these gaps. But I think from this whole conversation, what I'm getting is that actually we can't devalue reverse engineers. Everything that needs to be developed at the moment needs to be in support of them, not replacements for them, other than effectively automating away the boring stuff. If we're getting rid of the things that are complicated or the things that are arduous, right, like string obfuscation, sometimes that is a forgive my language, pain in the ass. And if I can get some AI to do it for me, fantastic. If I can handle debug symbols, right, you take a look at a Rust binary, we're like 4,000 functions, maybe more, and it's like I've got to go through and name all of them. Not a chance. But if AI can do it for me, even better. Interesting strings, if I can point out malicious functions, all of that is gold. One of the things that I'm loving at the moment, right, is you and I deal with source code. That's what we deal with. And obviously then that changes depending on the chipset, depending on the operating system. That in itself is a huge pain. But actually one of the things I'm loving, and this is a Revenge AI plug, but really because I like it so much, is that turning assembly back into source code. I think that is a huge step forward for AI solutions, right? Using the ability to take assembly and turn it back into source code to redo the structures and help someone look at it and go, I could run this. I could just test it and find out what's going on, as opposed to need to put it in a different tool. Or at the very least, give me a summarization of what this function is doing. That is always really good, because it helps. I think as a whole, it solves two problems, right? When you start using AI from a functional perspective, one is the ability to detect variance. I think that's something historically we've never been very good at as a community. We have, I mean, take a look at CrowdStrike and Microsoft. They're trying to sort out naming conventions for malware now because it's just so out of control. You see one small change and people are going, it's a new variant, it's a new thing, and actually, look, they've just added a new module, right? So I think AI is going to help us in that sense, in just at least condensing and consolidating some of these changes across the landscape, helping us go, where do I need to put my attention because there's something new and different that is deemed malicious that I should investigate within this binary that is different from all these other samples that are exactly the same. But I mean, that's just a whole thing in itself. I'm actually giving a talk in August at DEF CON on that whole premise, right? Deconstructing malware with graph neural networks. And I think, overall, man, it's refreshing to hear you talk about how much reverse engineering is still the same after 20 years, but how all of these changes are not threats to people's jobs, but merely adoption of new tools to speed up the reverse engineering process, to empower reverse engineers, because that skill set's not going to go anywhere.
Yeah. I mean, I think the key word is collaboration. As long as you have the perspective that you know that it's going to be something that you play a part in and apply your skill set, and that you can benefit from, then you'll be okay. I mean, I do think that reverse engineering will change. I mean, as you were just talking about. Source code. I mean, I think, for example, decompilers have been getting better and better, of course.
Yes.
And then now if you kind of add an AI component to that, I think there is a day in the future where, as a reverse engineer, you don't have to look at disassembly anymore. And that feels a little scary to say, because part of me is like, oh, but that's what I could do. That's one of my skill sets, right? Reading that stuff that other people can't read. But I think, again, that like I spend a lot of time looking at assembly, and even with my experience, it still takes time to understand and recognize a certain pattern of instructions. And even after years of experience, while that gets faster, it's still a little tedious occasionally. And so I think AI plays a role for sure. I mean, decompilers already are getting great at that. Tools like, for example, Binary Ninja, like, they actually, without getting too much into the product, I mean, they have a great decompiler, but they actually like openly encourage analysts not to use the disassembly. In fact, they're not even investing as much of their time and effort into the disassembly as they are into the intelligence and the context of their kind of higher level ILs. So I think we're already moving in that direction. But again, I choose to be excited about that, because that means that I can actually get a lot more done faster, and I can focus on the more novel stuff, the more interesting techniques, instead of just trying to maybe look up this instruction I haven't seen in a while.
Well, that's it, right? And in those situations, I mean, there's going to be decompilers where they get it wrong, and it's going to require reverse engineers to look at the source code, to look at the assembly. And in a lot of cases, there are still things now that you can only accomplish with assembly, right? The decompiler, and even to an extent the AI decompilation, is not going to help with things like creating new exploits, because you're looking for very specific byte patterns, which may be misinterpreted by a decompiler. So it doesn't necessarily make sense. But I think it's one of those tools to help speed up some of the arduous processes, right? If I can get string output or understand functions quickly, that are meaningful but not necessarily require my full attention, that's always super useful. Or at least in my mind, it's super useful. So I guess, I've got a final question for you. And then, obviously, we can just chew the fat some more, because I'm loving this. But do you, one of the... Actually, I've got a few questions. Oh, my days. I thought I had only one. No. So I guess, where do you see reverse engineers heading in the next 5 years? Will AI fundamentally change the skill set? I think we've touched on that a little bit through this, but I'd love to know where you think, not you personally, but where we as a community will be in 5 years' time.
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent I probably did touch on some of this, but I think that it's not going to change the skill set. It's just going to change how it's applied. And I think the way it's applied may be, in some cases, less actual analysis, and more really focus on just fine tuning things, right? Whether it's fine tuning an AI tool or the output or the validation. And so I think that, over the next 5 years, I mean, probably even sooner than that, we might enter a world where reverse engineers are spending less time, looking at the actual code and more time informing the creation of new tools to automate that.
Mm.
And so, I think if you're the type of person who, wants to continue just kind of responding to malware analysis tickets, kind of in the dark in the basement. I say that as I am in a basement right now. But if you're the type of person who wants to just be slowly kind of manually reverse engineering code on your own without talking to anyone, without using any of these like fancy, flashy tools, I do think that's a dangerous place to be because you have to participate, right? I think if you don't play in this game a little bit, then one day you may be kicked out.
Okay.
And so I think that all analysts are going to have to make that kind of. They're going to have to intentionally participate. It's not just going to happen. Um, but I also saying that can sound overwhelming with the number of
Mm.
AI tools that are like now out there. I think there's a certain level, and the approach I take is that I am in some ways waiting for the dust to settle. I think there
Yeah.
will be maybe a correction at some point. Right now, everyone's going the AI route. It's hard to even tell what products actually use AI and what are still
Mm.
just using the old ways but calling it AI.
Yeah.
So I think that we are in a phase where the dust needs to settle, and the contenders that are kind of left will hopefully be the ones that are more high quality that are worth investing time in. Because right now, if
Mm.
I were to start looking at malware analysis AI tools, I mean, even in that niche, there are many, many tools you could spend weeks just kind of trying to understand how they work and
Yeah.
assess the value they provide. So I think that experts are going to continue to be valuable. And again, I like to caveat the word expert. I don't mean you're in the top 1% of the world. I mean that you have some experience and knowledge and that you have done to some degree it the hard way. And by
Mm.
the hard way, I mean doing the manual analysis, not purely relying on the AI as a crutch, but instead using it as an accelerator. So yeah, those are kind of my initial thoughts on some of the changes that'll take place. But
Mm.
I think all of these are exciting. You just need to take the same approach that I advise for learning malware analysis, right? In the world of AI, which is like pick something and try to understand it, right? Don't worry about understanding every single AI tool under the planet. Just pick one or two that maybe a friend or a colleague has mentioned to you a couple times, right? So it's kind of bubble to the surface and just start there. And as long as you're playing the game or you're participating in some way, then I think you're not going to be left behind.
I feel like that's some great advice for people who are just getting started in reverse engineering, right? I think that touches on something that I really wanted to close with was that core piece of advice for someone who's just starting. And I think that sums it up beautifully, right? Is don't skip the foundation, don't skip the fundamentals, and actually get hands on. It's all well and good reading a book and listening and watching YouTube channels, but if you're not doing it, then are you really learning?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I most days I don't really know what's happening in the news. I mean, I really don't. I often go days without reading, quote, cybersecurity news because I
Mm.
have found there have been periods in my life where I would, start my day by, reading the latest tech news, and I could never cap the time, right? Like, 15 minutes would
Mm.
turn into 30, would turn into 2 hours, and
Yep.
so then I'm spending such a large portion of the day just reading instead of actually doing. And for me, the
Correct.
type of person I am, like, if I don't do it, I'm not going to retain it, right? So I can
Yeah.
read it, and I got to do it, and then maybe I'll retain it. And so, I honestly, I'll wait for things to bubble to the surface. So, once a week, I'll kind of see what news items have been mentioned many times. Maybe I've heard
Yep.
something from a colleague by then. I don't really. My pride is not based on knowing what's happening, 10 minutes ago. It's
Yeah.
based on having actual like the skills of a practitioner.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what makes me somewhat unafraid of the world of AI because I can do things.
Yeah.
And I
That's
think
it.
that if
No.
you can do things, right? If you can actually do things, that means you have expertise, even if it's six
Yeah.
months of knowing how to do things well. Like you have expertise.
No. Absolutely. I love that about the media. To be honest, is in my head, malware authors have always been pretty lazy. So when someone's picking up on something new that a an attack is doing or anything like that. I'm like, is it actually new? This has been going on for a while. Like, take a look at something like DLL sideloading, right? People go on about it I'd say every couple of months. I mean, we've just released an article on it, but every couple of months someone talks about it as if it's this groundbreaking new technology and technique. And actually it's like, no, this has been going on a while now. This is at least the last couple of years this has been happening. We saw it at Silence, and we've seen it before then, and we're going to see it into the future. The only time I think authors are actually doing something new and interesting is probably APTs, and by that point there's a whole bunch of researchers that are jumping on it like, a grenade, and so all you have to do is wait until there's so many articles shoved in your face that actually you'll be fine.
Exactly. And I love it when there's all these articles that are all written about the same thing. I think that's a great opportunity for not just me, but for anybody to actually dig in, right? To try and actually, if possible, download the sample, download the code, and try to maybe emulate the attack or the analysis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think one of the easiest things as well is actually, places like Medium and other ones, there are so many blogs out there that explain and provide the samples for getting into reverse engineering, getting into malware analysis specifically. I mean, take a look at like BRB bot. If you search for something like that, that is everywhere. There's like a billion write-ups. It's pretty much the first thing everyone actually reverse engineers, and there's a good reason for it. But there's so many write-ups on it that people can get fundamentally hands-on, which is quite nice. And it won't damage your environment in any extreme way. So really, if you have a terrible virtual machine, at least you're okay.
Yeah, so. I agree. I mean, it's one of the reasons why, sometimes people, even in the videos I post on YouTube, occasionally somebody will say, oh, this malware is like 3 years old. And I'm like, so what? Like 3 years, it doesn't matter if it's 8 years old. Like the same techniques are still being used today. And especially when you're just getting started, like you don't need this like triple layer obfuscated like binary. You need something that you can understand kind of somewhat straightforwardly and start brushing up on your skills. And then you can get into the more advanced stuff.
That's it, right? Is it checking for a debugger? Like how many things call is debugger present? Is it reaching out to a C2 server? Has it got encryption going on inside it? All of those things, those three fundamentals will probably be in 90% of the binaries you look at anyway. So getting comfortable with the idea of it in an easy to understand sample, doesn't matter if it's 3, 5, 10 years old, it's still fundamentally true. And you're not going to be able to handle the newer stuff unless you've looked historically at the older stuff and actually spent a bit of time getting comfortable with the premise. One of the things that I do like about AI at the moment is where it's picking out capabilities and actually kind of helping you understand quickly the capability of a certain piece of assembly, so that you can go, well, I know that this is actually handling XOR encryption, or this is for RC4, because it is going to change depending on what you're looking at, and if I can quickly identify it, it means that from a learning perspective, you can go, you know what, I'm going to extract that out, and now I can look at the assembly. Instead of having to write my own encryptor, I can look at this core bit of assembly and go, this is what RC4 encryption looks like when I'm dealing with assembly. I think that's a beautiful thing in AI, at least. So
yeah. And again, so just in the example you said, the human's now going to focus on the context and the purpose, right, of that encryption. So what is it encrypting and why, right? Now the human can add their value there instead of spending time remembering the details of the RC4 implementation and identifying it in assembly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I would love to chat more. I think I've got so many other questions, but I know you're done for time. So, Anuj, thank you so much for coming on and doing this. Thank you for helping us launch this new podcast. It's been an absolute pleasure having you here. And again, thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thank you, David. This was a lot of fun.
All right. And we'll end it there. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And keep an eye out for more of these.